protagonizada hoy por el profesor Snyder. No es la primera vez que tenemos el honor de recibir al profesor Snyder en la Fundación. El 4 de diciembre de 2018 presentamos su obra Sobre la tiranía, centrada en la defensa de la libertad frente al auge del totalitarismo. Gracias, profesor, en nombre del patronato de la Fundación, por acompañarnos de nuevo para compartir sus análisis y reflexiones que, sin duda, como la otra vez, nos dejarán huella y nos ayudarán a entender los grandes males que aquejan a nuestra sociedad y que nos impiden ser libres. Asimismo, me gustaría darles las gracias a todos por acompañarnos, a los que estáis hoy aquí en el Auditorio Rafael del Pino y a aquellos que en un número creciente nos siguen en directo a través de la plataforma online FRP-TV del canal FRP, que pueden encontrar en nuestra página web, así como de nuestras cuentas en las principales redes sociales, YouTube, LinkedIn y Facebook. Es un placer contar con su presencia y constatar su interés en el conocimiento de los fundamentos de la libertad, en los que el profesor profundiza en su última obra titulada precisamente Sobre la libertad. Quiero agradecer a la editorial Galaxia Gutenberg. María Cifuentes, editora de no ficción, está con nosotros, su colaboración en la organización de este encuentro y darles nuestra enhorabuena por esta nueva publicación y por tener siempre la puerta abierta a autores que contribuyen a la defensa de la libertad. No es casual que este encuentro tenga lugar en la Fundación Rafael del Pino. Cuando el fundador, Rafael del Pino y Moreno, mi padre, tomó la decisión de crear esta institución, tuvo como motivación fundamental la defensa de la libertad. Y en este marco, como rezan las palabras que tienen ustedes en la pared a su derecha, contribuir a la difusión del conocimiento y, en términos más concretos, a la formación de los dirigentes españoles actuales y futuros. Mi padre siempre entendió la libertad como una unidad indivisible. Permítanme parafrasearle. Solo desde la libertad deben los ciudadanos tomar sus decisiones y asumir sus responsabilidades. Solo desde la libertad deben las sociedades forjar su futuro. La libertad del hombre es una sola y engloba todas las libertades. No puede ser el hombre libre para votar, pero no para crear o emprender. La democracia estaría incompleta sin un sistema de economía de mercado en el que todos los ciudadanos tengan libertad de perseguir sus sueños, sean estos cuales sean. Lo esencial, señalaba, es dejar que el individuo se realice y desarrolle sin trabas su creatividad y su iniciativa. Asimismo, señalaba nuestro fundador que el ejercicio de la libertad exige instituciones solventes. No podremos actuar de forma útil y eficaz si el entorno que nos rodea no nos permite hacerlo con libertad, decía, y responsabilidad. No hay verdadera libertad sin aceptar de antemano la responsabilidad consiguiente. Si nuestra propia sociedad, si cada uno de los individuos que la formamos no estamos dispuestos a asumir la responsabilidad de nuestros actos, si esperamos que sean otros los que la acepten, nos estamos haciendo menos libres. En su nuevo libro, Snyder señala que la libertad es nuestro gran compromiso, pero que hemos perdido de vista lo que significa, y esto nos está llevando a la crisis. La verdadera libertad, señala, no es tanto la libertad de, sino la libertad para. La libertad para prosperar, para arriesgarnos por futuros que elegimos trabajando juntos. La libertad es el valor que hace posibles todos los demás valores. Cuestiones, entre muchas otras, son estas las que el profesor ampliará a continuación en su conferencia magistral. Para terminar, y aunque el profesor es de sobra conocido por la mayoría de nosotros, resumiré muy brevemente algunos de los principales hitos de su perfil profesional. El profesor Snyder es titular de la Cátedra Levin de Historia en la Universidad de Yale y fellow permanente del Instituto de Ciencias Humanas de Viena, donde dirige el proyecto United Europe Divided Memory. Es uno de los principales expertos a escala mundial en historia de Europa y una de las figuras intelectuales más importantes en el mundo anglosajón. Ha realizado relevantes contribuciones a la historiografía de Europa, especialmente sobre temas como el Holocausto, la Segunda Guerra Mundial y los regímenes totalitarios, por las que ha sido galardonado por la Fundación Hubble y la Academia Americana de las Artes y las Letras, así como condecorado por los gobiernos de Estonia, Polonia y Lituania. Sus 15 libros han registrado un significativo éxito y han sido traducidos a más de 40 idiomas. El profesor Snyder escribe también columnas de gran impacto en medios de comunicación como The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, The New Republic, The New York Times Review of Books y The Guardian. Gracias de nuevo, profesor, por su presencia entre nosotros y nuestra gratitud también a todos por acompañarnos. Muchas gracias.
Okay, thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for taking part in this conversation. And it's very important to me that it is a conversation. I look forward to your questions. And I don't mean that just in a formal sense. One of the things that I deeply believe about freedom is that no one person can be right about it. It's not the kind of subject where you can issue a series of declarations and come to a logical conclusion and be absolutely correct. Indeed, one of the things which is wrong about the conversations we do have about freedom today is that they tend to be led by people who are 100% sure that they're right, 100% sure that it's their freedom that matters, 100% sure that at this moment, the things that they want are exactly the same as the things that they should get. What I want to try to suggest in this lecture is that this is not really what freedom means. That if freedom has any meaning at all, freedom has to do with the good things in life. Freedom has to do with the things that we value. Freedom is the capacity or the state in which we can believe in good things, combine good things, and bring good things to life. If we did live in a society of free people, we would not be yelling at each other. We would not be insisting that we were right. We would not be angry all the time. This is my contention. And I'm going to start this contention from the radical position in which we find ourselves in the United States just right at the moment, when a small group of people who are very angry and who are sure that they're right and who act on their impulses and who happen to be extremely wealthy are in the midst of destroying my government from the inside. And when I say destroying my government, I don't mean that hyperbolically or metaphorically. I mean it entirely literally. We have reached the point where the largest government in the history of the world is being disassembled on purpose and without any attempt to hide this by a small group of extraordinarily wealthy people. And what I want to say about this, aside from the fact that it's shocking and should be shocking, is that it's not surprising if you follow the logic of negative freedom, which is the way that freedom is usually discussed, especially in the English-speaking part of the world. If you follow the logic of negative freedom, it won't be surprising that this is where we end up. Or, to make the claim in a more positive or hopeful sense, if we did understand freedom correctly, if we understood it in the positive sense that I'm going to prefer, we might end up with a much better form of politics at the end of the day. So let me just take a moment to describe what's happening in the United States, because I'm not sure to what extent it will have reached the Spanish press. It's happening very quickly. What's happening in the United States is that a small group of young men who work for the centibillionaire, the oligarch Elon Musk, who holds no official position in the United States and was not elected to any office, a small group of young men working for him have penetrated the major offices of the federal government of the United States, have taken control of important digital systems involving the workings of my government, including its payment systems, such that they, a small group of unelected individuals who are not even employees of the federal government, a small group of people can stop and start payments. This may seem like some kind of technical matter, but of course it's not. If the parliament passes a law, but somebody who's 19 years old can stop money from being paid, the Congress no longer has any power. The parliament no longer has any power. And if the parliament no longer has any power, then the voters also don't have any power. And this is not a theoretical proposition. A number of laws that have been passed in the United States are, as I am talking to you, being voided, being wiped out of existence by, again, a small group of young men who are working for an oligarch who holds no elected office. If they can stop laws from functioning, they make our parliament, our Congress, meaningless, and thereby they make our votes meaningless, and our status as citizens meaningless. So inside the United States government, we are now facing what can only be characterized as a coup d'etat. When you think of coup d'etat, you probably imagine colonels and lieutenant colonels and majors and with a group of a few hundred armed men, perhaps some jeeps and some tanks. If this coup d'etat had been like that, it wouldn't have worked. If you approached the Department of Treasury in the United States with 100 armed men and tried to take it over, that would fail. But if you approach it with a few fast-talking people who claim to be backed by the president and who were employed by the richest man in the world, it may not look like a coup in a movie, but that's the kind of coup that can succeed. And so as this news reaches you, what I want to suggest is that although this is shocking, it's not surprising because it follows perfectly from the logic of negative freedom, which is dominant in the United States and which is exemplified by the people who are carrying out this coup. Let me give you just a tiny, tiny example of the sort of thing that's going on. It will seem like a trivial example, but you'll see the sense of it in a moment. In the United States, for the last few years, we have been able to pay our taxes by ourselves. It's a very nice thing. You log on to a website, you enter some data, you push a button, and you can pay your taxes. I have a feeling you can do this in Spain. I don't know. Yes, no? Yes, okay. For us, anything you can do without having to pay someone is always a revelation. So one of the first things that Elon Musk did was to use his words, was to delete that. So Americans in 2 months, unless this is all reversed, in 2 months, when Americans have to pay taxes in April, we will not be able to do so on our own. We will have to hire companies to do it. Now, from the point of view of freedom, as it's presented in the United States as negative freedom, nothing bad has happened. Because from the point of view of negative freedom, freedom is just me against the government. From the point of view of negative freedom, the government can never do anything good. And so when Musk described what he had done, and again, this is just a tiny example, but it gives you a flavor of the ideology. When he described what he had done, he said, this service was government overreach. This was the government telling you what to do. In fact, of course, it was the government making your life easier. It was the government doing something for you. But in the ideology of negative freedom, the government cannot do anything for you. Everything the government does is bad. The ideology of negative freedom, as it functions in the United States at least, is a kind of algorithm. It answers every question for you. It says, government bad, your impulse is good. And the only thing in this ideology that can oppress you is the government. So the fact that you now have to pay money to a company to file your taxes isn't bad, that's good, because corporations cannot oppress you, only the government can oppress you, right? And if only the government can oppress you and corporations can't oppress you, there's nothing wrong with a very rich person who owns a lot of companies destroying the government. No harm has been done because the government can only oppress you. So I wish this weren't true, but this is the logic that is precisely being followed and being realized before our eyes. A single oligarch is destroying the government, and he is doing so in line with a set of ideas which are quite popular, and which I would submit are accepted well beyond the boundaries of the United States. Now, let's think for a moment a little bit about the implications of this. If the idea of freedom is just that it's negative, it's just me against something, and in practice, it's just me against the government, in that idea of freedom, there is no notion of human dignity. What is a person? A person is just someone who is against something. There's no notion of dignity in that. There's no complexity in that. There's no richness in that. There is, in fact, no humanity in that. If humans are just entities that bump up against barriers, we're hardly better than billiard balls. We're no better than a physical object bouncing off a wall. And that, of course, is exactly how Elon Musk sees you, or me, or any other human being. We are no different from other physical objects. And in his view of politics, the only thing that can be done with us is to instruct us what we are to be bouncing up against. So we might start by thinking, oh yes, it's me against the government. And then before we know it, we'll be instructed that it's actually us against our neighbors. And then the next thing we know, it will be us against the migrants. And not long after that, it will be us against the facts. And in this way, the idea of negative freedom leads very quickly, without very many barriers or pauses, directly to fascism, which we are seeing. If there is no notion of the human, just a notion of opposing barriers, you are creating a set of political ideas which lend themselves to the destruction of government, but also the treatment of human beings simply as agents of destruction, which is in fact what's happening. If freedom is just negative, if it's just you against something, then you don't have any rights. Because a right must be positive. A right must be something, a right must be to something. A right must have something to do with the fact that you're human. The reality that you're against things, or that I can manipulate you to be against things, that you can be mobilized to be against things, doesn't suggest any particular dignity in you, really at all. Robots can be mobilized against things. Objects, animals can be mobilized against things. The capacity to be against things is not an especially human characteristic. It's not especially dignified. And so when one agrees that freedom is just a matter of being against something, one is accepting the notion of freedom in which humans have no special dignity, in which there's nothing special about us. And of course, if that's true, nothing wrong has happened in the United States. If we have no special dignity, if we're just objects, then the fact that our elected representatives are powerless doesn't really matter. Why should we have the right to elect representatives? The fact that random 20-year-olds now have access to all of the private and financial data of every citizen of the United States, there's nothing wrong with that. We have no special dignity. We're just objects. We're just things that can be mobilized against other things. So the fact that Elon Musk can now push a button and find out how much money every single person in the United States has, can push a button and find out the social security number of every single American. Again, in a view of negative freedom, there's not really anything wrong with this. He's not the government, so he can't be violating your rights. And there's nothing special about us. We're just objects that bounce off other objects, so we don't have any rights that can be violated. I'm trying to say that there's an intellectual coherence to all of this. I'm trying to reveal the intellectual coherence to it. There is an intellectual coherence to the idea of negative freedom. It just doesn't lead the way that many people think it leads. It leads to the situation that the United States is in February 2025, which is the destruction of a very functional government at the wishes of an oligarch and a few other wealthy people. It is these extreme situations I want to suggest, and I try to suggest in the book, which should reveal to us common sense. As we go through our everyday lives, I think it's very easy for us to be persuaded by ideas that don't really work, like for example, the idea of negative freedom. It's very easy to say, oh yes, the government is always a problem, without thinking things through further. It's very easy to fall into the habit of just thinking, I'm right, and it's only the barrier outside that is wrong. But the extreme examples, I think, bring us to a different kind of common sense. So let's take an extreme example. What is the one thing that all of you have in common with Elon Musk? Or for that matter, the one thing that you all have in common with Donald Trump? The one thing that we all have in common is that we were born. That's the one thing that we all have in common. And that's the one sensible place to start a conversation about freedom. If you start a conversation about freedom, which begins with the one thing we all have in common, which is that we were all born, and we were all born helpless and incapable. We were all born dependent on a number of other creatures. Then we will have a very different conversation about freedom. In a world of negative freedom, we imagine that we are already capable. We already know our own ideas. We're already somehow self-reliant. And that is all in the background as we resist something that's around us. What that ignores is that in order for a creature, a human, a young human to become free, huge amounts of effort have to be invested. Individuals cannot be created without a society around them, which means that if freedom is to make sense at all, freedom can't be an analysis just of an already created human being and the challenges that person faces. Freedom has to be a discussion about the things that one has to have in place in order for a person to have a chance to be free. So that's an extreme example. Those of you who have given birth, or those of you who have seen a birth, will think of it as an extreme moment in life. But it's hugely typical, and it is the one sensible place, I think, to start a conversation about freedom. Extreme examples on the other side, from the side of death. So the other thing, I shouldn't have said the one thing. The other thing that you have in common with Donald Trump and Elon Musk and everyone else is that you're all going to die, which is helpful in thinking about these things. It's really striking, by the way, that some of my oligarch acquaintances in the United States think that they're not going to die. They're wrong about this. They're wrong about this. But it is actually a very important, it's a very important constraint to keep in mind. If we know that we're born, we die, we have a certain amount of time, we're limited, then we think about freedom one way. We think, I have limits. How do I turn my limits into possibilities? If you forget that you were ever born, and you believe that you will never die, you have a very different view of freedom, which is, I should get everything that I want, but I must be protected from all danger. And that leads you to a very different kind of place. But the examples about death I actually wanted to take historically and from contemporary moments, because they're very helpful in leading us towards what a more positive view of freedom would look like. One of these is the Holocaust of European Jews. So I've been talking about this book in various places, and it so happens that I was in Stockholm the other day when they were commemorating their Holocaust Memorial Day. And I was asked to take part in that. And so I was thinking about the Holocaust in connection with these ideas of freedom. And it brought to mind some primary sources, which I read some time ago when I was working on the Holocaust. And they had to do with what we call the liberation of the concentration camps. It's very tempting to speak of the liberation of the concentration camps. Everybody practically who commemorates the Holocaust at the end of January talks about the liberation of Auschwitz. I want to say that that's incorrect. I want to say that those kinds of places could not be liberated, and in fact were not liberated, that liberation simply does not apply. And the reason that I say that is that that is what the nurses and the doctors said. And on matters like these, I would listen to the nurses and the doctors. When the nurses and the doctors arrived at the camps that we would call liberated in May or in June 1945, they wrote in correspondence back home or in their diaries, they said, liberation is not the word. What did they mean? They meant that for the survivors of the camps, freedom was not the relevant concept, or at least it wouldn't be until these people were fed, until their illnesses were treated, until their physical and their psychological trauma was addressed. And of course, if you think about it for one moment, that's completely commonsensical. The idea of liberation of a concentration camp suggests that the moment that the torturers and the killers are gone and the correct army arrives, everyone suddenly is restored to full and beaming and ebullient life. But that isn't how it happened in reality, moment to moment, day to day. In reality, moment to moment, day to day, the survivors of concentration camps required a huge amount of care. And if you, like me, have been paying attention, reading, watching Holocaust testimonies given in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s to the present, you realize that much of that trauma is still with people. And you realize that freedom is not a question of yes or no, up and down, some kind of immediate reparation. Freedom is an ongoing project. And here's the thing. What you see in that extreme situation is actually relevant for the common sense of everyday life. It's like thinking about birth. If you think about survival, it brings you to the same logical conclusion, which is that what is true of the concentration camp survivors is actually true of the rest of us too. None of us can simply be made free by the removal of some problem. What the concentration camp example shows you is the extreme. No matter how great the problem, no matter how deep the evil, just removing it is not the same thing as liberation. And this is true for smaller evils and smaller problems as well. You might be oppressed in some way, but removing that oppression, although it's necessary, is not the same thing as you're becoming a free person. For you to become a free person, you have to have a sense of what you want, of what you care about, what you value, what's good in your world. And you have to have other people you can try to achieve those things with, and you have to have an environment in which that is all possible. Just removing the evil is not enough. The other, in my own life, or recently, the experiences that have helped me make this common sense were in Ukraine. So in Ukraine, in Ukrainian, there's a very useful word that we don't have in English, which is deoccupation. Probably you can say it in Spanish, I don't know, deocupación, I don't know, can you say that? It's a very useful word because deocupación, which is either a word or I just made it up, but you understand, is not the same thing as liberación, right? There's a space between deoccupation and liberation. And so when the Ukrainians say deoccupation, what they're specifying is we drove the Russians out. So the torture chambers are no longer functioning. People are no longer being executed. The evil is gone, but deoccupation is not the same thing as liberation. They have a word for liberation too. But the word deoccupation creates a space to pause and ask what the difference is. And for Ukrainians, often, it's very it's very interesting how down to earth it is. The difference between deoccupation and liberation is you've removed the Russians, but you're not liberated until the trains are running again. You're not liberating until the roads are clear. You're not liberated until there are playgrounds. The kinds of things that we don't necessarily associate with freedom are an essential part of what they think of as liberation. And I believe they are 100% correct. And this is something that I've seen as I visit deoccupied regions, which I've been doing for the last 3 years. These concepts and these ideas I'm drawing from everyday Ukrainians, but it's also something that you quickly understand as common sense when you visit places. So in Yahidne, which is a little town in north-central Ukraine, the entire population of the town was held by the Russian occupying army in the basement of a school. The entire population, babies, old people, men, women, the whole population was held in the basement, not given sufficient food, not given sufficient water. Quite a large number of people died of illness, and a significant number of people were also executed while this was going on. And then the Ukrainian army drove the Russians away. The survivors of that were not liberated. Their village was deoccupied. And this is something that you can see if you visit the school. If you visit the school, it has the sense of being haunted. There is the graffiti of the Russian occupiers, which is left all around the school. Much of it's been destroyed. If you go into the basement, which had been a place where children played, there's a list on one side of a door frame of all the people who died, and another list on the other side of the door frame of all the people who were murdered. And on the walls of the basement, there are the things that children wrote as they passed the time while they were being forced to stay in the basement. And those things are very touching and very poignant and very painful, but they're not the sorts of things that you would want in a schoolroom. They're not the kinds of things that children should go back to. And the place itself, you can't really send the children back to it as a school at this particular point. And so long as those children don't have a school, you can't really say that the town is liberated. When I left the town, the man who had given me the key to go to visit the school, asked for help in building a playground. And you might say, well, the Russians have just been driven out of the town, a full-scale war is going on, missiles are falling, people are dying. Why is he talking about a playground? But freedom is the answer, liberation is the answer. Just because the evil has been driven away doesn't mean that people all of a sudden are free. They need a whole lot of things again to be free. And for him, and for a number of the adults, one of those things was a playground. Because in everyday life, the children need a place to go if they're going to grow up to be free. These kinds of examples reveal themselves over and over again if you visit places like this, where war has changed things and where the occupying army has been moved away. Another example was in a place called Posad Pokrovska in southern Ukraine, where I visited a lady called Maria, who was living in a corrugated aluminum shack about 10 meters behind her house, which was in ruins. Her house was in ruins. Every single house in the village was in ruins. This is one of the settlements in Ukraine where the war destroyed every single residence. And I visited her, and she was welcoming and hospitable, and she wanted me to see how she had decorated her corrugated aluminum shack, and she decorated it very nicely. She had a quilt, she had her water bottles, there was a book that she was reading. She'd made the best of the situation. The situation, though, was that she was an 85-year-old woman living by herself with a handicap. Her village had been deoccupied, but she wasn't going to be free until the rubble was cleared between her little shack and the road. She walked with a walker. She couldn't get to the road because the rubble was still there. The buses weren't yet running on the road, so she couldn't go shopping. Until the buses are running, she can't be free. And so these extreme examples, I'm trying to say, extreme examples from what's happening in the United States right now, extreme examples of having to do with how we all begin life, extreme examples from war, from genocide, from death, I think lead us to a common sense. And the common sense is that freedom must have a positive side. Now, when I say that, I'm not saying that there's no such thing as negative freedom. What I'm saying is that negative freedom is only important as a part of positive freedom. If there's a wall in front of you, the important thing is not the wall. The important thing is you. If there's barbed wire around you, the important thing is not the barbed wire. The important thing is you. The reason why we care about the wall and the barbed wire is all of the things that you can become. And when the wall is pushed down or the barbed wire is cut, how free you're going to be as a person is going to depend on a million other things besides the removal of those barriers. So the case that I want to make in philosophical terms is that freedom has to be positive, given both the way we live in the world and also given a certain number of ethical realities. So now let me shift to the ethical part of this argument, or the philosophical part. It's usually thought that there are two kinds of freedom, negative and positive, and that they're distinct. My teacher at Oxford, Isaiah Berlin, wrote a famous essay about the two traditions of liberty, one negative, one positive. I don't think this actually works. I think negative freedom is one element of positive freedom. It's simply a necessary condition for positive freedom. The case for positive freedom morally goes like this. Stage number one, there are good things in the world. Justice is good, beauty is good, integrity is good, loyalty, honesty. These things are good, and they're real. They're not real the same way that this podium is real or my microphone is real, but they are no less real. So moral realism. The second part of the philosophical case is moral pluralism, which is to say there are many good things, not just one. So if you think that all good things come together as one thing, you're a totalitarian. Moral pluralism, and I'm happy to talk about that later, but the important point here is that moral pluralism holds, I think correctly and really indisputably, that there are many different things that are good, that there's no way to, so to speak, translate mercy into consistency. There's no way to reduce spontaneity to punctuality. These are just different things. They're incommensurate. They don't all fit together. It's not a baking recipe where you put all these ingredients together and then you have a freedom cake. They're different things which don't fit together. They don't merge together. In fact, and this is the third part, there's a certain kind of arithmetic or geometry that functions with moral goods that's different from the physical world. So in the physical world, I can say, with apologies, this hall is smaller than the hall that I spoke in Barcelona last night. And that would be measurably, objectively true. Oh, discomfort in the front row, I'm very sorry. But we can't say loyalty is bigger than honesty or better than honesty. They're just different. You can't say one is greater than the other. Normal concepts of mathematics or physics don't work in the moral world. In the moral world, we simply have to make subjective choices. There is no rule that you can follow which will tell you when you should be one thing and when you should be the other. The tensions are irreducible. They're always there. So consistency is a good thing, right? It's good to be consistent. But mercy is also a good thing. Most people would agree. But mercy is by definition inconsistent. To be merciful is to make an exception. Punctuality is good, like we said. I'm glad you were all here on time. That was very nice. Spontaneity is also good. But if you were spontaneous, you are not always going to be punctual. Loyalty is good. Honesty is good. If after the lecture, when I'm signing books, you come up to me and say, Professor Snyder, you look great. Is that honesty? Is it loyalty? The moral goods don't all fit together. And so the nature of the moral universe pushes us into a different terrain. And by the way, you can see this is also an argument against negative freedom, because a negative freedom wants us to be essentially physical objects and barriers to be the only problem. In negative freedom, morality, metaphysics are not supposed to play into the question at all. But in fact, if there are good things, and those good things are real, and they don't all go together, and we are forced to make subjective human choices among them, then we are in a different realm. We are capable of being in a different realm, a realm in which we make our own choices, and thereby, by affirming different moral values, become different kinds of creatures. We become unpredictable. We become creatures of character. We gain moral character. So this is the positive case for freedom philosophically. And again, you notice how it's different from the negative case. The negative case says you're fine. It usually says, I'm fine the way I am. And then negative freedom doesn't ask us to have any particular values. It doesn't even recognize, it doesn't have to recognize the world of values. It says, I'm fine the way I am. If I want to buy something, that's good. Whatever I do must have somehow been rational, and so on and so forth. Whereas in positive freedom, we take a leap and we say, actually, we accept there are good things in the world. And if you notice, like, if it's strange that I keep saying there are good things in the world, I hope you agree. Like, I hope you agree that life's better than death, and pleasure's better than suffering, and integrity is better than dishonesty, and so on. But as soon as you agree, if we agree with that, we've moved the dialogue to a place where politics usually doesn't go anymore. And that's part of the problem. You can't do freedom without ethics. And the moment you try to do freedom without ethics, you're going to be in a world of negative freedom, and pretty soon an oligarch's going to be inside your government destroying it. It's just a few tiny steps away. Okay. The second part of the case for positive freedom has to do with what kind of creatures we are. It has to do, as I've alluded to before, the fact that we are human and we are limited, and that we live in certain kinds of bodies. And this has a couple of implications. One of them is that we are free to do only the things we know how to do. Okay? I realize that this might seem like a bit of a letdown, because if you've spent a lot of time in American culture, or you've watched a lot of our movies, you have been instructed that everything is possible. It's a very popular slogan, right? It seems to come back again and again. And having already, now that I've done the big reveal that we're all going to die, I don't feel too uncomfortable making the second big reveal, which is that, in fact, not everything is possible. And when people tell you that everything is possible, that's actually a prelude for the next move, which is that nothing is possible. That's the way it works. Because if you're told that everything is possible, you will soon find out that's not true, and you will move into a moment of malaise. And I would suggest, just as a brief excursus here, that a lot of our politics is actually just like that. That the 1990s and 2000s were a moment when we were instructed that communism is over, everything is possible, the past doesn't matter, all these sorts of things. And when that turns out not to be true, because America invades Iraq, or there's a financial crisis, or social mobility flatlines for decades, when it turns out that not everything is possible, the easiest mental move is, okay, nothing's possible. Hopelessness, malaise, lack of a future, which I think is a pretty good description of where a lot of our politics are right now. So freedom has to do with the notion that some things are possible, and the more capable we are, the more free we are. And that our capabilities have to do with the neurological, biological, sociological kinds of creatures we are. In other words, if we want to be more free, we can't just think about the barriers in the government. We can't just be constantly finding enemies and things to oppose. We have to concentrate our attention on what it takes to help people to become more capable. When they're old, when they're middle-aged, when they're young, it takes different things. But at every stage in life, freedom is a matter of capability. Freedom is corporeal. There's a second way too that the corporeality of all of this is very significant, and that has to do with self-knowledge. In order to be free, and I think everyone would agree with this, in order to be free, we have to know ourselves. We have to know what we want, we have to know what we value, we have to know, even an advocate of negative freedom would say, you have to know your own interests. Right? But the truth is, and this is important advice for all of you out there who are in relationships, the truth is, we're very bad at knowing ourselves. It's actually not a particular human skill to know yourself. We're not good at it. And if you doubt me, ask that person you're in a relationship with. Ask your mother how well you in fact know yourself. Ask someone who really knows you. And I say this not really as a joke, but in fact as a serious point. It's in general, the essential part of the argument for positive freedom is you can't make an individual all by yourself. You can't. A baby, to take the extreme case, a baby cannot grow up to become a free human being all by itself. It's ridiculous. A young person needs schools, roads. An older person needs other kinds of support. You simply can't make an individual with an individual. You can only make an individual with the help of society. Otherwise, it's impossible. And to believe anything else is a deadly illusion, which leads to tyrannical domination. But what I'm getting at is a very specific example of this. Assuming that in order to be free, we have to know who we are, which I think is a safe assumption. The only way to do that is to listen to other people. And the only way you'll listen to other people is if you believe that they are human beings like yourself. The only way to know yourself is to be empathetic and to see the world through someone else's eyes and to see yourself through someone else's eyes, which is pretty easy to say, but it actually takes a lot of work to do it. But what I'm trying to say is that all of us, we all go through life with huge bits of metaphysical spinach stuck between our front teeth. And we all need for someone to tell us that it's there. That's just what it's like to be human. And we can't get to the point where we trust someone to tell us what we're really like or what's wrong with us unless we empathize with them, unless we really believe that they're real in the same sense that we are. The person who made this point about freedom was a German Jewish philosopher called Edith Stein, who, as it happens, was murdered in Auschwitz. And she came to this point, which is a very, I think, commonsensical point. She also came to it from an extreme situation. She served as a nurse during the Great War, during the First World War. And month after month, tending the wrecked bodies of men, she realized, I believe in their reality because I understand their bodies. I see their bodies as being like my own, as being woundable, damageable, vulnerable like my own. Therefore, I see that they're real. And because I see that they're real, I can empathize with them, and therefore I can learn with them. So what I'm trying to say is that a theory of knowledge that we need for freedom has to involve other people. And that insofar, and this is now a practical point, insofar as we live isolated from other people, unable to trust other people, alone, isolated in front of computer screens, which algorithmically reflect back to us the things that we already believe and reflect back to us our views about the world that we already hold and reflect back to us our usually quite false self-images. Insofar as we live like that, we can't be free. We can't be free. So to bring this to a close then, if I'm right, if these extreme examples have been helpful, if I'm right that freedom is positive philosophically, if I'm right that freedom is positive corporeally or empathetically, then I think freedom is also positive politically. And what I mean is that freedom becomes the thing which justifies government. So in my country, at least, or in English language discussions, at least, there's thought to be this tremendous tension between freedom and government. This is a very comfortable point of view. Like all binaries, it's very comfortable. Humans are very comfortable when presented with two options, and then we choose one. That kind of binary thinking, by the way, is a sign of unfreedom. It's simply not the case that freedom and government are in opposition. That's not true. You can have good governments and you can have bad governments. You can have governments that liberate and governments that are tyrannical. The test for government, in my view, the test of its legitimacy, is whether it creates the conditions for people to be free. I believe that, personally, I believe that's the only thing that government should do. That justifies a rather large government, but it doesn't justify many things that a government might do. If it's true, as I've argued, that in order to create individuals, we have to have collective work, then the government is that agency which in a large society makes that collective work possible and thereby makes freedom possible. So there is no tension between government and freedom. It follows, by the way, that a number of the other tensions that we've been taught to think are impossible barriers are not real either. Like, for example, the tension between security and freedom. One of the things that we're taught, at least in English, you can tell me it's different here, is that we're in a constant tragic struggle between freedom and security. This is actually not true. The cases where freedom and security are in tension are very esoteric and unusual. 99% of the time, if I can make you more secure, I'm also making you more free. And 99% of the time, if I'm making you more free, I'm also making you more secure. There is almost never tension between those two things. One of the things that the Ukrainian president told me, which stuck in my mind because it's so obviously commonsensical, he said, when we deoccupy a village, we bring both freedom and security. And of course, that's true. Both freedom and security are brought at the same time. So I think a lot of the problems that we think we have with freedom are not intellectually real. I think they've been trained into us. And I think that freedom, if it's right as a justification for government, which is the case I make in the middle part of the book, if it's right as a justification for government, could also be a concept which helps us think a little bit differently about our politics. So in the United States, freedom as a term has been almost entirely captured by the right, and even to a considerable extent by the far right. And there's a problem with that, which is that the way that they use freedom means essentially the individual's right to always act on impulses against other individuals. So, for example, free speech on the American right, and to a large extent in American dialogue generally, free speech means I am very angry and I happen to have $100 billion and I happen to own a social media platform and I should be able to make sure my angry views about you reach 1.4 billion people and not just 1.3 billion people. Free speech in the United States is largely understood to be a matter of the government stopping people from saying the things that they want. And of course, it's bad if the government stops you. But if we think about free speech only in that way, if we don't think about the person, but just the utterance, then we find ourselves in a kind of ridiculous position. Let me try to walk through this. In our world, almost none of the utterances are human. As you go through your day and you're exposed to the internet, the huge majority of utterances, the huge majority of things that are said, spread, communicated, do not directly come from a human being. And nevertheless, when we talk about free speech on the right, what we're concerned about is the ability of the internet to penetrate your lives. However, that way of thinking about things is only possible because we're forgetting about the human. What is free speech really about? The reason we have freedom of speech, which is the better way to talk about it, is that it's dangerous, physically dangerous, for less powerful people to speak the truth to more powerful people. That is the historical and, in fact, the only coherent justification for freedom of speech. The reason why I have freedom of speech is to protect the vulnerable bodies of the less powerful as they speak truth to the more powerful. That's why it exists. And that way of thinking about freedom of speech is, of course, positive. It starts with the reality of vulnerable bodies. It starts with the reality that some of us are more powerful than other people, right? It's a tradition that goes all the way back to Euripides. That's the way we've talked about freedom of speech for 2,500 years, essentially until about last Thursday. Very recently, we came up with the idea that free speech is just about the utterances, the algorithms. And when we think about it that way, then suddenly free speech only matters for people like Donald Trump or Elon Musk, the people who are at the top. Whereas we think about freedom positively, then we realize, okay, Donald Trump and Elon Musk, they have a right to freedom of speech, of course, just like everybody else. But because they're among the most wealthy and powerful people in the world, they're not the ones we worry first about. They're the ones we worry last about. And everybody who is less powerful and less wealthy than they are come first in freedom of speech, and indeed in any other kind of freedom. So that's just an example of one example of how the term freedom has been captured, right? The other problem with letting freedom just be on one side of the political spectrum is that then people on the center or on the left stop using the word. And if you stop using the word, then you end up giving up on the concept and on the thing itself. And it's my very strong view that whether you're a green or whether you're a conservative or whether you were a liberal or whether you're a social democrat, a socialist, you can't do without freedom. If we try to do without freedom, we're going to end up with a very different kind of politics. And so then the last word about this that I want to say is that it seems to me that we need to be able to share this word in a way that makes sense. In my country, we talk about it all the time, but we talk about it in entirely the wrong way. And that, in a way, I think has the same effect in Europe or around the world that the monopoly of the right on the word has inside an individual country. We talk about it all the time, and it's really not clear what we mean, and often it's just nonsense what we're saying. And Europeans tend to talk about it less, even though the normal European country allows its people to live in much greater freedom than the United States does. By our own measures, by our own institution, which is Freedom House, which reckons freedom in a very American way, we are about number 50 in the world, and you're ahead of us, and EU members are generally ahead of us. And the reason for that is very simple. If you have a country that focuses on positive freedom, you tend to do better on negative freedom as well, which is a conclusion that breaks the brains of Americans. I have to repeat it about 50 times. Don't worry, I'm not going to do that. But we think if you can only do negative freedom, and if you do positive freedom, that will create some kind of Nazi or Soviet dystopia. Whereas the empirical truth is, the record is that if you do positive freedom, you end up doing better on negative freedom. If you only do negative freedom, you end up doing worse on negative freedom. And of course, you also do worse on positive freedom, right? And that's the reality. So, but Europeans, in my view anyway, and you can correct me or disagree, but Europeans who live in countries where people are quite free don't talk about freedom very much. And they certainly don't talk about it as a justification for the welfare state, or as a justification for government spending, or a justification for childcare, or for parental leave, or for all these things that you have that we don't. And I think that's a mistake. So I think we have the right word, and Europeans tend to have some of the right practices, but none of us have the right concept. And sharing what I think is the right concept, the concept of a freedom which is rich and human and positive, is what I've tried to do in my part of the evening, and I will look forward to the part where we get to exchange. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Snyder, for this inspiring lecture.
Thank you.
And congratulations on your new book on freedom, sobre la libertad.
Thank you.
I'm sure that, yes, please. I'm sure that your words and ideas has generated a lot of questions for all of us here today. No? We open now the question and answer session, and according to the rules of the foundation, and also you know that one of the aims of the foundation is to defend Spanish as a vehicle of communication in the world, so we always develop the introductions and the Q&A sessions in Spanish. So I switch now from English to Spanish to correctly convey your questions. Okay? So, bien, dejo por aquí el libro del profesor Snyder. Saben que pueden posteriormente adquirirlo y que además van a tener la oportunidad de poder recoger la firma del profesor Snyder posteriormente, la dedicatoria de su libro. La verdad es que han ido llegando un montón de preguntas de todos ustedes, he intentado ordenarlas, pero como decía aquel famoso literato español, pues hemos venido a hablar de este libro, ¿no? Pero pueden entender que también hayan surgido multitud de temas, ¿no? Estando aquí el profesor Snyder, han surgido muchas preguntas relacionadas con qué está pasando en Estados Unidos, también sobre Ucrania, el papel de Europa y otros aspectos, ¿no?, relacionados con estas temáticas que también conoce el profesor. Pero quizás comenzamos por las primeras preguntas que tienen que ver quizás con una serie de cuestiones centrales en la obra. Por una parte, la cuestión de la autonomía personal. Por otra parte, un segundo bloque que he intentado ir sintetizar sobre las instituciones y la intervención estatal. Y en tercer lugar, hay también bastantes preguntas relacionadas con la relación entre la libertad y el ejercicio del poder, la libertad y cómo vencer el statu quo, ¿no? Esos tres aspectos. Entonces, yendo a la primera cuestión, la cuestión central, ¿no?, cuando hablamos de libertad, que es la autonomía personal e individual. Pues, señala en su obra el profesor, y lo ha mencionado durante su conferencia, que esa visión clásica de la libertad en Estados Unidos parece insuficiente, ¿no? Argumenta que la verdadera libertad se basa en la cooperación, en la participación en instituciones comunes, ¿no? Nos plantea Manuel Castán, entre otras personas, si no se corre el riesgo con esta argumentación de minimizar el valor de la autonomía individual, plantear una visión de libertad basada en la interdependencia en lugar de en la elección personal. Esa sería una primera pregunta.
Okay. So, I can't answer the question directly because what I'm trying to do in the book is to suggest that individual autonomy is not something that we can start with or take for granted. So I certainly agree with advocates of negative freedom that the individual should have an autonomy which ought to be protected from oppression and that sort of thing. However, in order to get to the right notion of freedom, I think, we have to ask where that human autonomy came from in the first place. We can't simply assume that it exists. And this goes together with another question I'm often asked, which is, how do we deal with the fact that many people don't want to be free? How do we deal with the fact that people often don't act as though they are autonomous? And there is indeed a problem there. So where I'm starting is by accepting the difficulty that humans are not, in fact, by nature, individually autonomous, because we're not. If you raise us in most of the ways that human beings have been raised throughout human history, we will not end up as individual and autonomous. In order to create autonomous individuals, you have to have the ideal of freedom, and you have to do a lot of work to create the conditions so that a person can grow up to be an autonomous individual. And that is realism. Like, that is starting from, I think, a much more realistic point of view than to start by talking about individual autonomy as though it were automatically a thing in the world. I do not believe it is automatically a thing in the world. I believe that individual autonomy has to be created, that freedom begins as a project from birth. Or to put it a different way, freedom has to be a historical process. It has to involve generational work. If I don't see anyone here who's in an advanced state of pregnancy, so this is theoretical, but if somebody here gives birth tomorrow, the conditions of the life of that baby will not depend upon the baby or even the mother. They will depend upon the generational work of people in Madrid or people in Castilla or people in Spain or people generally to have created childcare, roads, schools. It will depend on that. When the baby is thrown into the world, the baby is thrown into a world which is either less or more supportive of creating individuals. And if you deny the baby basic things, that baby is much less likely to grow up to be autonomous. The baby is much more likely to grow up to be someone who is anxious and needy and easy to manipulate. And so this logic that you need society to create an individual is always true, but it's most intensely true at the beginning. So I'm concentrating on how you get to personal autonomy. The second point I want to make is when we just assume that there is of individual autonomy, we're often doing something which is historically dangerous. Because in the tradition of freedom, of writing about freedom, at least in the English language, we're starting with an image of a person who is individual and autonomous, but who has become so in a certain way. And traditionally, and this is the Greek example, and the Roman example, and the Victorian British example, and the 19th century American example, traditionally the way that you become individual and autonomous is that you are a man with property who owns slaves and has a lot of women at your beck and call. That is usually traditionally how you become free or autonomous, is that you're standing at the top of a pyramid and there are a lot of people helping you, right? And then in philosophy, that whole historical background is blacked out, and we're left with the person who has already become individual and autonomous. And I'm happy to grant that there were plenty of Greeks and Romans and slaveholders in general who were individual and autonomous. I would have some objections to just how free they were. But what I would say is that if we're going to talk about individual autonomy, we have to be historically aware that the way it's generally been produced has been at the cost of most people not being individual and autonomous. And that in order to think about freedom seriously, we have to have a starting point where we all could become individual autonomous, and that can only be done cooperatively. So in my book, I consciously talk about sovereignty instead of autonomy. I mean basically the same thing, but I use the word sovereignty because I'm trying to suggest that it takes work, self-aware work, historically self-aware work, but also psychologically self-aware work to create people who are sovereign, who are capable of making choices, who have their own values, and so forth.
La segunda cuestión que he mencionado, antes de ir a la relación con el poder, es esa relación entre instituciones e intervención estatal. En On Freedom, el profesor, en Sobre la Libertad, sostiene que la verdadera libertad, como ha mencionado, no es solo la ausencia de restricciones, la libertad negativa, sino la capacidad de actuar y prosperar, la libertad positiva, ¿no? Entonces, para ello, propone la necesidad de instituciones sólidas que garanticen oportunidades reales para los ciudadanos. Sin embargo, nos plantea Marlene Docampo, Marco Suárez, otras personas que sintetizo un poco en esta cuestión varias aportaciones, ¿no? Nos plantean si si para ello propone la necesidad de instituciones sólidas, como he dicho, si este enfoque podría interpretarse como una justificación de una mayor intervención estatal. Pregunta concreta: ¿no existe el peligro de que este modelo termine socavando, reduciendo la libertad que pretende promover? Y otra cuestión que ato allí también: ¿quién decide cuáles son esas oportunidades legítimas y cuál es el límite a la intervención gubernamental?
Okay. So again, I'm going to start by talking about the terms. What is a government intervention? So the term government intervention itself is inside a whole vocabulary which assumes that negative freedom is the right way to talk about freedom. If you're in a negative freedom world, the word government is usually followed by intervention, and the word intervention is usually preceded by government. And the implication is that everything government does is some sort of intervention. And the other implication is that all the interventions in your life that are negative are carried out by the government. So that phrase, government intervention, is very comfortable inside a certain set of assumptions. But obviously not all interventions are by the government. Elon Musk now has all my personal data. He's not government. The social media companies have all of your data. They're not government either. And likewise, not everything government does should be understood as an intervention. So I gave the very simple example at the beginning of the lecture. When my government allowed me to file my own taxes, that wasn't an intervention. It was a basis of freedom for me. When my government provided me with public education when I was a young person, that wasn't an intervention. That was an enabling of me. And so I don't like starting the conversation with the phrase government intervention, because I think that phrase, which is such a cliche, forces us into a negative freedom vocabulary, which I think is basically wrong. What I'm trying to suggest, though, is not that government should be large per se. I'm actually proposing a pretty clear limit on what government can do, and that limit would be, does a given proposal or policy make it possible, given what we know about limited human beings, for us to be more capable, for us to be more free? And by that criterion, an awful lot of the US government would probably go away, but other parts of the US government would probably grow. To say that the point of government is to serve freedom isn't to say that government should be bigger, it's to say that government should have certain kinds of purposes. In fact, I would say it's a pretty clear set of purposes. It's true, of course, that it's impossible to define where those purposes would stop and start. But I would propose that saying that government is there to serve freedom is much more commonsensical than a negative freedom way of looking at it, which is to say government is intervention except for the things that I like. So, for example, property rights. People who are in a negative freedom world, they really like property rights. Property rights are good, but property rights are a government intervention. They don't exist without the government. And so like the negative freedom way of defining this is to say, well, government is quite bad, except for the things that I like, except for the things that preserve the current structure, like property rights. Those things are quite good. And this is true of libertarians in the United States in a very dramatic way, right? So our libertarians are largely hydrocarbon oligarchs, and they are very in favor of property rights that allow them to dig up coal and gas and oil. And of course, the way that they got those property rights in the first place was a massive government intervention which killed the native population and cleared the land for them. So they don't have anything against that government intervention. They don't talk about that, right? And so and the other kind of libertarians we have are the Silicon Valley libertarians. And the Silicon Valley libertarians say, we got rich all on our own, we did it from nothing, the government had nothing to do with it, etc. Which is, of course, completely 100% incorrect. It's Orwellian how wrong that is. The entire internet was built with American taxpayer money. The transistor was a result of American government research, hence taxpayer money. Basically, all of the fundamental technology that enabled Silicon Valley was created as a result of government intervention. And thanks to that government intervention, a few people were able to free ride with some incredibly primitive software, by the way, in the late 20th century and make a huge amount of money. And now that they've made a huge amount of money, they go back and say, well, I don't want to have government intervention. And what they mean is, I don't want the government to take away taxes, the money that I made, thanks to an earlier set of government interventions, which I'm going to pretend never happened. So to get to the question of what legitimates government, what doesn't, I don't think it comes down to big or small. I think it comes down to purposeful or not purposeful. And in the bulk of the book, which I didn't have time to talk about, I talked for long enough, I try to define what those things are between the philosophy and the policy. And those are what I call the forms of freedom. So there's sovereignty, unpredictability, mobility, factuality, solidarity. The things which have to do with the way we live, but also with the things that policy can provide.
Bien, vayamos con el asunto del statu quo, ¿no? La tiranía del statu quo y la relación entre cómo reconciliar su visión de libertad con la realidad del poder, ¿no? La verdad es que menciona Mónica Oriol en una pregunta que lanza, ¿no? Que hemos comprado el concepto de gobierno opresor y se pregunta por qué hemos comprado ese concepto de gobierno opresor y se prefiere uno mínimo, ¿no? En ese contexto, si vamos al contenido de la obra del profesor, su enfoque sobre la política de la abundancia, la generosidad y la gracia es muy inspirador. Pero la historia ha demostrado que los intentos de construir sociedades basadas en valores colectivos a menudo han derivado en imposiciones autoritarias, ya sea por falta de incentivos o por esa tiranía del statu quo, si me permite, utilizando aquella obra de Milton y Rose Freeman, ¿no? sobre estas cuestiones. Hay dos preguntas muy concretas. Por una parte, Rafael Montero, junto a otras personas, plantea: ¿cree que es posible vencer esa influencia del statu quo? ¿Y cómo se puede hacer? Y en segundo lugar, sobre el poder, si el poder es inherentemente corruptible, ¿no deberíamos ser más escépticos ante la idea de que la libertad pueda depender de instituciones que, en última instancia, buscan perpetuarse a sí mismas?
Okay. So, no, I don't think so. I really don't think so. Let me start with the first part of the question. So there's a certain argument, let me try to present it on its own terms. There's an argument which says that when we have good intentions, we build bigger governments, and then those bigger governments end up being oppressive, and so good intentions turn out to create bad things. And historically, this argument is usually based on a couple of examples which don't really work. So Friedrich Hayek, for example, was a very influential thinker, and by the way, I agree with Hayek on most things. But Hayek was a product of interwar Austria, and Hayek's writings have been taken to mean that the way that we got to National Socialism in Austria and Germany had something to do with the interwar Austrian welfare state, which is 100% wrong. That has no basis in reality whatsoever. There is no sense in which the interwar Austrian welfare state led to the rise of Hitler. They are completely unconnected events. There is no way in which the the communal housing that the Austro-Marxists built in Vienna somehow led to Hitler becoming Chancellor of Germany. There's just zero connection. It just didn't happen that way. And so that whole story, which Ayn Rand tells, for example, that as soon as you start building up a welfare state, you're going to end up with an oppressive state. It's not, and I'm saying this as a historian now, it's just not historically grounded. And the same thing goes with the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, I'm against it too, but the Bolshevik Revolution had nothing to do with a gradual buildup of the state and its welfare services. The Bolshevik Revolution did not happen because Tsarist Russia had too much free kindergarten. That's not how the Bolshevik Revolution happened. The Bolshevik Revolution was a dramatic, violent break based upon the firm belief of people that they understood the one thing which was good. And this is a point where I want to agree. It is a terrible thing if you have one good idea of society. I agree with that. That will lead you to totalitarianism. I agree. It's a terrible thing that Marx thought that he understood human nature. Marx's view was we all have essentially the same human nature. There's only one bad thing, that's private property. You take it away and then we'll all be happy and good. Those kinds of ideas about there just being one good thing are always going to turn out to be disastrously wrong and tyrannical. I agree with that. But as I hope you noticed, my whole argument was that there isn't one good thing. If there were one good thing, then my whole argument for freedom wouldn't make sense. In my view, the argument for freedom is that there are many good things that you can't reconcile, and that each of us individually works out for himself or herself what good things matter and what combinations at what time. That the argument for freedom is precisely that there isn't one good thing. If you think there's one good thing, you are a totalitarian. But that is not my view. That is not what I'm arguing for. I am anti-totalitarian. And I would turn this argument around slightly and point out that if you think that private property, so if you think private property is all that's wrong with the world, which is what Marx thought, you're completely wrong. But if you just reverse that and you say private property is all that's right with the world, you're going to end up in a very similar place. There is no one good thing. And I'm going to note that what we did in 1989 was a strikingly dialectical re-embrace of Marxism. In 1989, we learned, people understood, okay, these Leninist systems have failed, which they did. And what did we do with that knowledge? We said, okay, economics, we said, taking away private property was disastrous. True. And then we said, capitalism will bring us freedom and democracy. It's the same idea, my friends. It's just put in reverse. It's not true that private property is the only evil. It's also not true that private property is the only good. There is no single evil, there is no single good. There are many evils and there are many goods. And so my story cannot be a story of good intentions going wrong, because I don't believe there's one good thing. I believe that you should all be free to pursue the good things that you think are good, and that it's the job of politics to create the conditions in which that's possible.
Quedan 3 minutos para concluir el acto de hoy y ni se pueden imaginar los centenares de preguntas. Siento muchísimo no poder canalizarlas todas. Voy a hacer un salto mortal y voy a hacerle una pregunta que va a intentar resumirlas todas. Hemos hablado mucho, profesor, de libertad, pero no tanto de liberalismo. Entonces, hoy por hoy tenemos todo tipo de conceptos, ¿no? Liberales, libertarios, socialliberales, anarcoliberales, neoliberales, ordoliberales, smithcianos, austríacos, libertad como reconocimiento, libertad negativa, libertad nacional, de muchísimos aspectos. De hecho, tuvimos en la Fundación en un diálogo al ministro griego, Yanis Varoufakis, que después de declararse marxista dijo que él era liberal también. Entonces, hay mucha confusión sobre esto, profesor, ¿no? Y doy el salto mortal, ¿no? Siguiendo las preguntas de Alessio Di Genaro, de Julio Weiss, de muchas otras personas que nos acompañan. Gracias por participar, ¿no? Doy el salto mortal, ¿no? Primero, ¿cuál es su visión del liberalismo? ¿Qué es lo que desde su punto de vista no es liberalismo y qué sí lo es? Y finalmente, y ahí ya salto absoluto, con todas las preguntas que han llegado sobre qué está pasando en Estados Unidos, qué le está ocurriendo al Partido Demócrata, qué le está ocurriendo al Partido Republicano, qué está ocurriendo en Europa, ¿no?
Okay.
Con todos estos elementos en la agenda, ¿dónde sitúa usted el liberalismo que responde a su obra sobre la libertad? En ese espectro. Muchísimas preguntas sobre Milley y tal. Se las ahorro.
Yeah,
Con todo el
I
respeto.
like this idea that like we have 3 or 4 questions for you, and then each question has 9 different questions inside it. So, okay, first of all, I'm just going to say this is not a book where I try to referee the current state of discussion about freedom, let alone the current state of discussion about liberalism. I'm not doing that in this book. In the book, I'm trying to say what freedom in fact is. So I actually take a very conservative view of this question. And my conservative view is that there is a right answer and there's a wrong answer to the question of what freedom is. And I'm trying to get to the right answer. That's what the book is about. So I'm much less concerned with questions about what is liberalism today and what's the right form of liberalism, because those have a inherently political quality to them. And the book is, in fact, it's a philosophy book that has political implications. It's not a political book that has philosophical implications. It's a philosophy book that has political implications. So I'm not dodging the question. I'm just saying that the way the question is set up, Professor Snyder, you talked a lot about liberty, but what about liberalism? Doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because liberty for me is the absolutely central thing. It's the thing that I think we have to figure out. I'm happy to say something about liberalism, but what I'm going to say isn't probably going to be satisfactory, because the spirit of the question is we can figure out what liberalism is and isn't and draw the boundaries correctly and separate it from other things. That's not going to happen. You're not going to be able to say liberalism starts here and stops here. I can answer the part of it about where liberalism has gone wrong a little bit. In my view, people who are called liberals hold very different kinds of ideas, but where I think many liberals went wrong in the 1990s and 2000s in my country, but not only, was accepting that freedom was just about the absence of government intervention, accepting that the end of the Soviet Union would mean that the rest of us would be free, which I'm just going to point out has turned out not to be true. So Americans are less free now than they were in the 1980s. We're less free in general. It hasn't helped us in a 30-year perspective that communism came to an end. It helped the people who were under communism, but it hasn't helped us. We're less free than we were back then. We're also less socially mobile, and we're not richer. So it hasn't helped us at all. What's hurt us is the idea, and this was a liberal idea. It's an idea that Hillary Clinton has expressed or Barack Obama has expressed, as well as people like George Bush in different words. The idea that freedom was going to be brought to us by history or by capitalism, that idea has really hurt us a lot, because that is in fact an anti-liberal idea. That's an authoritarian idea. If you think that freedom is going to be brought to you by any larger force, then you have taken on an authoritarian mindset. Freedom can only be about the things that you care about and how you push them out into the world. If you think freedom is being brought to you by capitalism or by anything, by capitalism, by national exceptionalism, by history, by any abstraction of any kind, you were essentially saying, I'm not a free person, and I don't want to be a free person. I want to live in a world where the larger forces are taking care of things for me. And if the larger forces are taking care of things, you're not going to end up free. You're not going to be a free person. So that is a mistake that liberals made. Not only liberals, but liberals certainly made that mistake. Thinking about freedom negatively and then thinking it's going to be a result of some larger historical process. That was not only incorrect, but hugely morally and politically damaging. The way I'm going to close, though, is that I'm going to say that on my view of freedom, there cannot be a single political label which can capture all of the truth. So no matter how you define liberalism, I don't think you can say liberalism is going to capture all the truth about freedom. One of my teachers was the Polish philosopher Leszek Kołakowski, who wrote a playful essay in the 1970s referring to communist Poland, but it has, I think, a much more universal application. The essay was called How to Be a Conservative Liberal Socialist. I'm glad that you, I don't even have to give you the rest of the essay. It sounds funny, doesn't it? But if you take a pluralist view, which I do, you don't think that those ideas are in opposition, because they're not, in fact. They're mutually complementary. So the position that I took up here in my lecture was the position of a conservative liberal socialist. The conservatives are right that virtues are real. The liberals are right that freedom is the most important value. And the socialists are right that you can only preserve traditions and make people free with the help of cooperation. Everyone is right, but no one is right on their own.
Bien, la verdad es que ha sido un colofón impecable para esta conferencia, ¿no? Gracias. No podemos estar más de acuerdo con el profesor en que la libertad es el valor principal, ¿no?
Okay.
Entonces, pero permítame 2 segundos simplemente para concluir como se debe, agradeciendo, ¿no? Agradeciéndoles a todos ustedes por habernos acompañado, también a nuestros seguidores por internet que cada vez participan más lanzando preguntas, agradeciendo, por supuesto, a la editorial Galaxia Gutenberg, la colaboración y las facilidades que ha puesto para poder desarrollar este encuentro. Mucha suerte con esta obra, no la van a necesitar, seguro que será un gran éxito en su línea editorial. Y, por supuesto, agradeciendo al profesor Snyder que nos haya visitado de nuevo para compartir sus conocimientos. Thank you very much, professor.
Okay.
It's been a really good to have you with us today.